Hello, everyone. This is the Web Talk Show. My name is Armando Perez-Carreno, and today I'm joined by Zach, a performance engineer from BigScoots. How are you, Zach?
Hey, how's it going?
Thank you for joining us. I'm very happy that we could get this call. I'm very excited because we're going to try to tackle some topics that a lot of people don't get into, which are related to how your site performs and why it can perform that way. So I really appreciate you coming on the call today. Zach, you work at BigScoots in performance. BigScoots, for those who don't know, is a fantastic hosting company. I use them for a bunch of our sites as well as some other hosts, but I can truly say that there is a big difference in support and performance with BigScoots and other companies, and that's why I particularly like BigScoots for hosting. I have clients on Kinsta, WP Engine, all sorts of different hosts, even on WP Cloud. But what I really like that I haven't found elsewhere is that your support team is next to none. I mean, you get an issue or just have a question, you reach out to support, and someone, at least in my experience, you always get someone in a high tier of knowledge to answer your request and getting that conversation going instead of canned responses and other things that I have seen before, had experience with other companies. So very happy to be able to discuss with you what happens behind the scenes to make this all happen, because it looks like magic from our standpoint. So Zach, how did you get into all this performance, etc.?
So I started at BigScoots in 2021 as just like a regular Linux systems administrator.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 2022 into 2023, I showed an interest in helping customers with like performance-based problems, like they failing core web vitals, their checkout was slow, whatever you want to go into. And I kind of got thrown into the fire. I kind of got promoted to start working on performance stuff, kind of one of the first people on the performance team. And I've just been working at that ever since. So that's like my history at BigScoots is I've kind of just been there for essentially 4 years, I guess you could say, going on here soon. And then before that, I was in like kind of the like kind of tech startup world here out on the West Coast and things like that. And then before that, I was in the military. But before I was in that, I got involved in web hosting back in like 2005 when I was a teenager, like in high school. So I've been kind of off and on in the web hosting industry. I worked at a data center back then as well, like when I was like 18, 19. So I've been kind of all over the place. But I feel like my experience overall has kind of helped me, kind of always, no matter what job I've had or what role I've had, I've always kind of made sure things were as efficient as possible. So I think it kind of fit me that I was, kind of in this performance role now. So
then that fits with what I've perceived from BigScoots, and also got reiterated when I heard how the company got started and sort of the bare metal beginnings of the hosting and then evolving into WordPress. And it's the fact that you work or have worked with data centers and directly on Linux and performance at the lowest level, not and only in the application layer, gives you a very different perspective into how things work, because a lot of people get stuck in the application layer and they're just like, oh, well, let me just patch on a CDN or some caching, and we'll get into caching later on, which is great and definitely necessary. But one needs to first figure out what's going on at the very basic level before patching on things that will help you scale. Right. And so that is great. I'm very happy to hear that you have that experience, because I'll give you an example for the listeners out there. When we had a particular very niche scenario with a customer website where we needed a specific page to be, I don't know, regenerated or purged from the cache or whatever, for whatever reason, whenever something specific happened, if I asked any other host to help us with something like that, they would be like, no, our caching works this way. You can purge it automatically or with a button based on just these specific rules. But on BigScoots, we would get an engineer on board and they would be like, oh yeah, we can put a script on your server that does this whenever this other thing happens. And they would know the inside out of not only the WordPress site, but also the infrastructure underneath the actual server and what's happening. So I found it great. And can you speak to that a little bit? Like what makes you different in that sense?
That's a good thing. So obviously, as you know, we have our own data center and we own our own hardware, and that's kind of like we can kind of get into that as well. But on top of that, we have our own software that we use for on WPO or managed WordPress hosting that we manage and control, right? We have our own software development team that is constantly working on that. And then on top of that, we have a WordPress software engineer, Samya, who works on our BigScoots cache plugin and other performance-related topics interfacing with Cloudflare Enterprise. So we kind of control everything from top to bottom. I mean, we control it from all the way at the edge there in Cloudflare, all the way down to like someone plugging in the network port on the server and data center, right? So
nice.
Because we control everything in between, like you said, we control everything in the process. So we can modify things in our cache plugin. Let's say that you come to us and you have this specific need or something like that, and it's not even in our cache plugin. And if we think it's worthwhile and it'll help you out, we will deploy a temporary version of that cache plugin for you that has that rule, and then we'll just release that for other customers at a later date, right? So we kind of really like to have that customization. I mean, we still kind of like have a product, right? But we still like to offer and do whatever we can to make sure like our customers are taken care of. So yeah, I mean, we control everything in the process on the server, everything. We have a customer that they have like read and write speeds and the database is slowing down and stuff like that. Like we can just throw them on a different server in the data center. And we have people there that can just do it. Right. So I think that's really kind of our prowess, is that we control the entire process and everything in the process. So there's no like waiting on a third party or doing this or that to get problems done. So, and kind of reiterate on your point, I when you first kind of talked about like, all of our people that work with us are skilled. We don't really have like entry level employees. I mean, not saying that we don't train people, but I'm just saying like we kind of go for like the cream of the crop and try to get like the best people we can, so that when you do find a problem, we're just addressing it right away. So
that's great. I think that is one of the main reasons I wanted to have this conversation with someone from BigScoots and not another hosting company. And I'm happy to have anyone for any other company as well. And we've hosted with other companies also. But I think the way you do it brings back to basic principles, because you own the infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
The hardware. And so it's like if back then I had someone host my website and they had it in their machine, and I could call them up and say, hey, what's going on with this? Can you make this adjustment? Or something happens, somebody actually sees it happening in the monitoring and the logs and make an adjustment quickly, right? Like you were saying, you can literally just move them to another box if necessary, or scale horizontally, or do whatever you need in a personalized manner, which I think a lot of companies need, especially a lot of businesses that are selling online. Some of them might be smaller businesses. They can't afford to have a whole tech support staff, but maybe they are doing well, or maybe suddenly they get a big traffic spike, or suddenly they get a lot of sales. And if you're on any of these other sort of more scaled up hosting providers, which they're great, and I'll get into that as well, I think there's a disconnect. Because, for example, if I go on Kinsta, for instance, and I like Kinsta very much. I have many customers there, and they do a good job. But it's hosted on, like, you might be hosted on AWS or Google Cloud, right? And great, because it scales. But the problem is that you are generic. You're just one of thousands of customers. Nobody knows who you are. And you ask for support, and it's all generic support, like we were talking about. And the problem is not so much like, hey, I want people to know who I am. Well, while it's great that sometimes when I talk to BigScoots, it's like, hey, Armando, and I know that person, I've interacted with them before. It just allows you to do things much faster because they know the history, right? Whereas in one of these bigger companies, that doesn't happen. But the important thing of this, I think, is that you can do small adjustments, like you were saying. Hey, I need more memory because I'm paying a bunch of money for this server anywhere, and for this particular reason, I need a timeout that is longer for this particular process in my website. And they'll just say, sorry, this is the timeout. This is the max you could do. Or, hey, I need more PHP workers. And we might get into that as well. And for those who are not technical, we'll get into that. But you want more PHP workers? And they're like, no, the limit is 4. You have to upgrade to another tier to get more. Whereas on another host, maybe BigScoots, you can say, hey, no, there's no limit. You can do how many you need, right? Or depending on whatever that may be the case, right? So I think just having this discussion with someone that actually knows what's going on and what happens behind the scenes is a great idea, because we can lay some of the groundwork for those who are just hosting their website anywhere just because they think they just need a host, to understand what can make a website faster or slower and why these things happen and why the different choices of hosting provider might affect performance as well. So getting into a bit more of the technical stuff, if you're up for it, what happens on a WordPress page load? I think a very small percentage of people really understand what happens when you load the URL into your browser and a WordPress page comes up. Like, what happens behind the scenes? Could you enlighten us a little bit?
Pretty much like, this is a technical question. Is like, is it cached or is it uncached, right?
Right. Let's say it's non-cached, right?
Okay, yeah. So pretty much you're going to have WordPress is going to spawn like a process, like say it's PHP FVM, and then it's going to generate the HTML, and then it's going to go to the web server and present it to the visitor, right? So I'll give you an example, and not trying to make it too simple, but how if you ever worked with like an old school, like not old school, but like a web server like Apache or Nginx or anything like that, and you go and you create like the index.html and it says hello world, right? WordPress is essentially generating that on the fly for the visitor when they load up your page or URL for that. So
and I think that's a great example, because if you go back to basic servers and the web, when you go to a website, the browser sees an index HTML and it loads it, and it's just HTML that it reads and it shows it to you. And there might be some CSS to style it, etc. But WordPress, even just for the most basic page, will do a ton of stuff, because it's, like you said, generating it dynamically, which means it has to look at its templates, and there's a bunch of hooks that fire throughout the process, and it's going to say, okay, where's my header? It's going to either grab it from the database or from the file system, and it's going to generate the HTML for the header. And then what goes in the body? What page am I on? And then it's going to load that, and then it's going to do the footer. So even for a very basic, just homepage, it has to do all that. And some of those require database queries, and some of those will have to do checks on like whether the user is logged in or not. And some of these might spawn even other processes, right? so it very quickly can become something that is complex, and it's done in milliseconds at the end of the day, but many other factors can come in and affect this.
And like we were talking about uncached and cached, right? And I'm not trying to get too much into this, because I know we're early in the conversation, but that's kind of like what the point of caching is, and why so many hosting providers and Cloudflare and everyone recommends it, even WordPress because instead of every time somebody visits your website, this process has to spawn and do everything you just said. The HTML is there, and it's served to the visitor, and there's a lot less processing. So with a basic site, you're looking at cutting off the load significantly. So, and that's, a lot of cases, you'll see a website that's just getting slammed with traffic and they have no caching set up. They may be able to do like 500 visits a minute or something like that. And then you just implement even some basic caching and they're getting thousands without any problem. The server's not sweating. So, yeah, I'm getting more on the performance side of things than the basics, but
that's great.
Yep.
And people should know this. So there are very different levels of caching too.
Yep.
And for those who don't know what caching is, it's like Zach was just saying, there's but different levels. But let's say at the edge, if you're talking about Cloudflare, your site might generate that page once, give it to Cloudflare, and then Cloudflare sort of stores it for a specified period of time. And so everyone else who's going to visit the page from then on, as long as there's no changes, will see that copy of the page that's already rendered. It has already been generated. So your server doesn't even know about these visits a bunch of times. And so that sort of edge catching is great because it takes, like you said, a tremendous load of your server. But then it gets a little more complicated because some of these platforms might be something like e-commerce, and you cannot cache everything because you've got products that change prices because of discounts. There's depending on the user, if someone adds a cookie because they added something to the cart, now you cannot cache the whole page. So what happens then, Zach? Do you cache parts of it, or how does one manage caching when every user is different?
In a dynamic environment with e-commerce. I mean, obviously certain elements are cached, right? Like the assets, right? Like on your CDN, like you have your CSS and JS and things that aren't changing can be cached, right? So that's one load off of things having to be served. And that's been out for like decades at this point. So, but there is object caching. But to be honest with you, in WordPress, and I'm kind of showing what BigScoots is good at, is that we kind of like to throw horsepower at it. I mean, there's nothing really beats having, like, if you have a checkout and you want to have like a really high clock speed on the server, we'll do that for you. And that's always the way to get the fastest checkout. I mean, you can set up object caching. We've set up Object Caching Pro. We've done all these things for people, and optimize Redis like a million times trying to get things to be, and nothing beats clock speed and fast memory, like and fast hard drives and things like that. So it's kind of like we go bare bones, and we really just try to throw some horsepower at it, so to speak. So that's kind of like what our approach is to it. I'm not saying you can't use other things to speed it up, but just in our experience working with a lot of different WooCommerce and other dynamic sites, LearnDash and MemberPress and all these other things that have heavy loads, it's just sometimes you just can't beat like good old bare metal clock speed. It's the best.
Yeah, and you bring an excellent point. The thing about scaling, there are multiple ways of scaling. If you have a very basic site that everyone sees, and it doesn't have to be basic, but let's say you have a news site, but regardless, everyone sees the same news. Sure, you could strap on some good caching on it, or maybe even object cache in some scenarios, and you can get millions of visitors with a very basic server, right? Because everyone's viewing the same thing, and you're just doing very small queries sometimes to regenerate the cache. But a lot of people, especially nowadays, have highly dynamic sites, like you were saying, WooCommerce, right? MemberPress, LearnDash, BodyBoss, BodyPress, anything related to users having their own set of things that they're viewing that are unique to them. If you have a little social network and a newsfeed in your site, or e-commerce or e-learning, then all that goes out the window. Not all of it, but a lot of it goes out the window, because you still have to process, even if it's a little bit, you still have to process all these either REST API requests or WP admin, WP Ajax requests that are hitting the server for little things like, what are my points? Where am I in the course? What is the new price? How does this coupon work, right? So even if you have everything set up, you still, at some point, somewhere, you have to run these processes. So like you said, that's where on highly dynamic sites, having the bare metal power changes things, because you can process a ton of these, maybe you spawn a bunch of PHP workers and it's fine because each one will run a very short amount of time, especially if you don't limit them. And I want to get into this also. And this is one of the reasons I actually moved to BigScoots originally for some of my clients. The fact that you have very fast clock speed servers and many PHP workers allows a site to be able to process many things basically at once. So a lot of these requests come in and there's many people who can, well, not people, PHP workers that can grab all these tasks and process them quickly because it has a high clock speed and just get them through the door and everyone's happy, right? Whereas in a lot of these sort of cloud scaled solutions, that clock speed is slow. And so the problem is that even though it can scale to whatever you want, those processes take time to process. And then there's a lot of times there's limit on the amount of PHP workers you can have just because of how the infrastructure is set up, right? And so that, many people don't know, will affect memory usage as well. So what we saw happening with one of our customers was that another host, they would just suddenly get the memory out through the roof. And it was because the host was limiting their PHP worker count. And so there were not enough PHP workers. So there was sort of this queue of processes that has to run. And so the memory was like, I don't know, 200 megabytes or whatever per visit. And you just increase the number of PHP workers available and it went down to like 50 megabytes. Just the same query, same everything. It's just the amount of PHP workers that were available. And so that is tremendous. So could you talk about that a bit? Like why would some hosting providers limit the number of PHP workers? Why does that happen?
So, I haven't been at every hosting provider to tell you their back end, but the way I see it is it depends on how their back end is set up in terms of like how they're limiting things. So at BigScoots, we're very traditional, kind of old school in that, we're putting, if you sign up for like a WPO starter plan, you're being put on a virtual machine and we can limit the numbers of CPUs and memory that you're assigned and hard drive space. It's kind of a, and so for us, that works very well. And we're very close to bare metal and it's fast as you experience. But if I give you 1,000 PHP workers and you use them all, and not that was a crazy amount, but you'd hit the CPU limit and the memory limit, and you wouldn't affect anybody else, right? So we don't need to limit your PHP workers to control you stepping on other customers on that infrastructure. Okay. But if you were to use like something infrastructure set that's more like horizontally scaled, right, like a Kubernetes or something else similar to that, where they may have like a containerization going on, right, where like the PHP is processing happening in a different container, but it's all like kind of a shared infrastructure or cluster. They may need to limit the PHP workers just to prevent you from stepping on other customers in that same setup. So that's the way I see it happening. Also, it could just be like you are on kind of a shared server environment. Is another thing, like where just like cPanel sort of, cPanel has Cloud Linux and stuff. I won't get into that, but generally it's just talking about like a standard shared server. Maybe they are sharing CPU and memory among their customers, and it's not containerized, but they still need to limit, like in PHP, FPM, or whatever they're using, to those processes just to prevent stepping on each other. So that's the way I see it, why they would limit by that. But every provider has a different setup. So I'm not trying to say this is concrete or this is why it's happening, but it's just more or less a way to control the amount of resources the customer is using on that infrastructure. So for us, we're setting it on the system level. Like we're setting it saying you get two, I'm just making these numbers up because we don't really have fixed CPU and memory numbers per plan. Like if you need a little bit more to get that 250K visits we advertise, we'll bump it up. But just say we assign 2 CPU and 4 gigabytes of RAM. That's kind of like what you're set up in or what you're jailed in, right? So jail's a bad word too, because it is an actual virtual machine. It's not CageFS and all this other stuff. But we're limiting that. And so, like you're saying though, we like to control the PHP workers and not define it because, like you were saying, sometimes it could be bad to have too many PHP workers, and sometimes it
Mm-hmm.
could be good from a security aspect, right?
Right.
So somebody could find a way to a plugin or something to spawn a bunch of workers and time out your site all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of limit it. I think we start like our base config is like 25. But if you need more, you just submit a ticket and we'll give you more. If
Yeah.
you need less,
But
it's there's no like.
but that's even funny because it's
Yeah,
like some of these other companies will give you 4.
yeah.
And if you do a staging environment, they'll give you 1. And they don't
Mhm.
tell you. So you have 1 PHP worker. And so you're on staging and you can never really develop properly on staging because it's tremendously slow and you run out of
Mhm.
memory all the time. And the people
Yep.
don't know this. And they're like, why can't I? And so yeah, it's people end up working in production because it's so slow on staging, but it doesn't make sense because staging should just work the same way and just lock it down such that it doesn't affect your visitors on regular
Yep.
hours, right? But anyway, so I've seen that happen, and then other things are like memory usage and things like that. It's very strange, and I don't know if you can talk to this, but I find I haven't gotten a good response to this from anyone.
Mhm.
Why will the same exact site have such a different load time amongst different hosting providers? And I don't mean cache, like turn off all caching, all object cache, CD, everything. Just the site itself just running, and you're looking at the query monitor or whatever. You're looking at the what the server render, server generation time is, and you go to one and it's 0.5 seconds, and you go to another one, it's 1.2, and you go to another one and it's 3, and these are similar infrastructure, similar servers or similar offerings. Why is it so different, and why can't we properly benchmark something to see like, well, is my site slow, or is it that my site in particular on this infrastructure is slow? And that's where I think it gets very confusing, because it's like, sure, I run it on my machine, and for some reason the M1 Pro Max or whatever, you run local on them, they're blazing like extremely fast, faster than any server. But then you put it on a server and it slows down quite a bit. That's fine. But the same site on different servers or different hosting providers will perform very differently. But then another site might perform better on another combination of hosting providers. So why does that happen?
So there's there's a lot of things that could be happening, but I mean, you got hardware, you got network, you got a lot of things going on. But something that's been common in web hosting, and I'm just one part of it. I'll get into other things, but is like overselling. So pretty much you can, on a hypervisor, right? Like you may have a server that has 32 CPU and 64 gigabytes of RAM, and you would think that you can only sell that much, but realistically you could pretty much spawn as many virtual machines as you want on that server in the hypervisor, right? I mean, when I'm hypervisor, I'm talking about like whatever you're using, Zen KVM, or like you're using Hyper-V, or getting into, depends on the provider what they're using. But so you could have a certain provider that like they know that maybe only 30 or 40% of the customers are actually using the resources that they are assigned. So they may squeeze out a little bit more profit margin by overselling the server, but then the neighbors are a little noisy sometimes. So sometimes if it's Black Friday and everyone's site's getting hit or whatever, now all of a sudden things are a little bit slower because on the node itself, there's things waiting to be processed on the CPU. So that's one thing, overselling. And like I said, I'm not saying it's all the case, but also, you could go to a different hosting provider and they could have one node that they just set up 2 weeks ago and they've put like 5 customers on it, and you go on it and there's no overselling, and because they haven't provisioned it yet, and it's fast and great. But then 3 months down the line, it's slow because they've filled out their quota or whatever you want to call it on that node. Like I said, I'm not saying every provider does this, but if you kind of like look up overselling and web hosting on Google, like you'll probably see a million articles about how this has been a problem since like the 90s. Hosting providers doing this. So
that's actually a good point, because it could actually be that it's not the site itself that's like, this site performs differently on these providers and this other one performs. Well, there is that possibility, but also it could be that just the slot that you got in that
Mm-hmm.
moment is faster. And if you would have put the other side there, it would have been fast as well. But then the next slot you got was already over
Yep.
provisioned or whatever. And
Yeah, and like I
that
said,
makes sense.
I'm not trying to dog any hosting providers. There's a lot out there that really have firm standing that say we're not going to oversell, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of your premium providers are like that. It's something that kind of plagues, especially when you get into the lower costs and stuff like that. So that's one thing. Second is just, hardware. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you could get on a it's very easy to mask like what CPU you're on,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you could see that it's like 3.2 gigahertz or something, but it's like a E2030 from like 2011 or something that
Ah.
you're on. So versus that clock speed on a modern processor, whether AMD, Intel's gonna be a lot better, right? So
Mm-hmm.
um, there's that hardware differentiance. Are you an SSD? Are you NVMe? Uh, Things like that. Um, Network issues.
Mm-hmm.
So we've recently, network was good before, but we've recently redid our entire network. We even replaced all the cables and everything. Complete
Wow.
ground up network change. And peering to different providers, and I'm just talking about like TTFB and things like that. So if you have and I'm not a network guy,
Mm-hmm.
I'm just being blunt with you. Like I know enough to like get in trouble, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
but if you have like the right providers and you're peering properly, um, you know, if say that data center may only have like one or two uh, network providers set up on it, and like now you're all the way. This is in Chicago, and you're all the way in Los Angeles, and things aren't set up right with that provider that
Mm-hmm.
you're using, then all of a sudden it's taking like 80 or 100 ms to reach the data center, versus that if things were peered correctly. And like I said, I'm sure some of my network people at my job are going to make fun of me for this, but like if the network's set up properly and you're peering right with your different providers and things like that, then all of a sudden it's like 40 or 50 ms. And then in the data center itself, again, like are all your networks set, all your switches set up properly? Are you not maxing or overloading anything? Every millisecond you can shave off
Mm.
can really
Yeah.
improve times. So on the network
That
side.
is
So
a good point. So milliseconds and time to first byte for those who don't know the acronyms.
yeah.
You were talking about the TTFB, but the every millisecond makes a difference. And this is a very good point because, like we were saying, especially on dynamic sites, and I think this is where the most issues lie across providers. You expect it to be fast, like I'm hitting the server, I'm getting something back. But that's
Mm-hmm.
not the truth, is it?
Mm-hmm.
It's I'm hitting the server, but then the page is asking it for something else
Yeah.
and something else and something else to complete the request, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then if the delay between you and the server, or the ISP and the server, or the edge and the server is higher, then those little gaps between those requests add up, and suddenly
Yes.
you have like a second page load extra of just back and forth.
Yeah, and I won't get too like in depth. We can do this later, but like TTFB, us increasing TTFB, not increasing, improving
Improving.
TTFB, uh, um, has such an impact for our customers, even on like the core web vital level, because if you can shave off 500 milliseconds, that's going to affect all of your core web vitals in a positive manner. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, just improving that TTFB and cutting down all that talking back and forth. There's a lot of tricks to improve TTFB nowadays, not just on the hardware and network level, but I think you're kind of more going on the kind of like base server. Why does this host perform better and this one doesn't, and stuff like that. Getting back on that for now. Yeah, hardware and network is definitely key. And like I said, because we own our own data center, we own our own networking equipment, everything's we can kind of customize the solution for the customer to ensure they're as fast as possible. And like if and like I said, the idea that every hosting provider goes out and buys 1,000 of the same servers is not the way it works, right? Like we may have a node that has a lot of processors on, a lot of CPU availability on it. So it's like an Intel Xeon, but the clock speed's like 2.4 gigahertz on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that may work for a customer that needs a lot of a lot of processes to spawn, right? So we may allocate them more CPU, but then, let's say you have a WooCommerce site or something like that. We may provision you on a server with a node with less
Mm-hmm.
CPU, but higher clock speed. So
Right.
it really depends. And that's like our approach is we don't really try to pigeonhole you into one thing. We will kind of see your site. And switching into a different node is like a few clicks. It's really
Mm-hmm.
not a big deal.
Oh,
So,
wow.
so we do that quite regularly if we have to kind of make sure your website's going to perform. And that's where we really like to get in the weeds and look at the
Mm-hmm.
logs and look at how your service is performing, how your website's loading. There's a lot of things that go in there on the back end that we're doing, and every customer is really unique. So you just kind of have to make it work for them. So
that's, I think, where the value is, because
yep.
every customer is unique. And so if you adjust things for them, it's gonna make their site perform better. You don't need a blanket works for everyone approach. It's better to segment. And you can even, if you're doing it like you're saying, where, hey, this site needs less of this type of resources, then you provision them here. And if they need more of this other one, you provision them there. And so even your own resources are better utilized, because some actually require the lower clock speed, or some require the higher clock speed. And so it just makes more sense to do it that way. It's, some perhaps could say it's less scalable in like the extreme scale company size. Like, I want to have millions of customers and manage them all. Yeah, of course, that could mean it's less scalable. But I mean, it's not all about that. It's also about providing the actual service people want.
Yeah. And if you have a situation at any host where you're like, oh, I'm going to have 1 million people at checkout on this day, and I need that to work, we will build a custom solution for you to make that work. There is, I don't think you can take that and go to any hosting provider and it'll work without them setting up some sort of enterprise setup with high availability and all that stuff. It kind of gets, unique, but yeah, we can do that too. So I'm not trying to say that's not possible, but yeah, generally speaking, your normal e-commerce person that just wants to, set up, they're selling like blankets or something on their site, and they get, 50 checkouts a day, and we can customize, we can kind of make sure they're working well, versus we have somebody that has a static blog that they get a lot of traffic, but they don't really, the edge caching is what's important to them, not really the hardware they're on. We can kind of or customize things, or maybe they have more AJAX calls. There's a lot of things. It's hard to like I said, pigeonhole into one specific thing, because there's a lot of variables per every customer. So we just kind of make it work for them based on their setup and what we're seeing.
And I saw that in practice with one of our customers. We had a launch last year, and I was very impressed, because what happened was, I heard from BigScoots, from a performance expert, and said, okay, I'll give them a try, because of the recommendation. So we set everything up, and the launch was coming, and I let your team know. And so you expect, okay, yeah, sure, they know, right? But any other. But what really happened was that the morning of, yes, it was a big launch. There was a celebrity that was doing a live stream, and cart was getting just smashed by hundreds of people at a time. And so transactions coming through and everything. But what surprised me was that the BigScoots team was proactively monitoring the launch. So they were looking at their systems, and they would tell me what if something was close to a range. So I would get these updates from Justin or someone like you wouldn't expect in the company, to like, oh, everything's looking good, these thresholds are a little closer, but we're fine. And then a little later, hey, these things are heating up, but I saw this particular plugin is using a lot of your resources, you don't need it right now, let's just take it off. And so this whole experience was a breeze, because everything worked, because there was actually someone looking at it and taking the time to make sure that it was a success. Whereas I'm sure everywhere else, because I've had experiences like that before, something were to happen, let's say they wouldn't have done that, eventually maybe the memory would have run out, then the site would have gone down. People would have hit with 502s, and then we would have to reach support, and then we'd be like, what's happening? Oh, I have this issue. Oh, let me get you with someone. And then would like 10 minutes later, maybe I'm talking with someone. Maybe they restart. I don't know, right? And but in this case, they could even provision more resources. They could make things. And so that, going back to the basics we were talking about at the beginning, the fact that you own the infrastructure and that you're there, you can see what's happening, is such a different experience than what I'm used to. And I just think these days it's very good to have this type of scenario, because I don't know, it's real, right? It's like real people doing real things to make your business work. So I don't know. I think that's a great approach.
Yeah, if you tell us you're having a busy traffic, you're expecting something, we'll go like internally, we'll go and set on us. You tell us what time it's going to happen, and we'll create a ticket, and we'll set on our reminder like internally, and a sysadmin will keep an eye on it. And that's really common. I mean, I see it happen all the time. We've had a couple Shark Tank launches and stuff like that we've helped people out. So yeah, or they, again, like you said, a celebrity or they're going to be featured in some news station. We've done a lot of that. So yeah, like you said, we can go in the slow logging, and we can figure out like what plugin is eating up time, right? Like it's hitting a 20 or 30-second timeout, and we're like, oh wow, that's a social, not social sharing, but I'm trying to give an example of a plugin that wouldn't be useful, but it's kind of hard off the cuff. But like,
no, I know what you mean. Like something that you don't need at that moment because of the circumstance.
Yeah, but it's eating up all this CPU or whatever, or database queries, and we're like, just deactivate it, and like we deactivate it tomorrow. And like I said, we've done that for a lot of customers. Yeah, we like to do that. It's actually kind of fun. That's one of those things that, like, it's kind of fun to do. I think it's hard to convince people not to want to do that ticket. So it's always cool to kind of optimize things and see how real traffic is interacting with the hardware and the network and stuff. So
I don't think anyone expects like someone at the data center or hardware level or network level to actually be excited about this, but I understand completely what you mean. Like, these are people who actually enjoy what they do, and looking at a server being like consumed by a swarm of users and seeing how it responds and how you can make it survive, it's like a game, right? So if you really love what you're doing, then you're gonna do a good job, and the customers are gonna be really happy. So it's a win-win.
Yep. I'm thinking of I was. You say it doesn't matter the plugin, but like, broken link checker, that plugin,
right?
It runs a lot of like it's notorious for like I had a customer like a couple of weeks ago where they had a high traffic event and they submitted a ticket, and I'm like, well, do you really need like all the broken link checker to run all its checks right now at like 2 in the afternoon for you? Like let's deactivate this plugin, right? So with stuff like that happens. Real world example of like us just recommending something in the short term to get you on the road. So
and even. Yeah, I just look. It sounds like I'm just praising BigScoots, but really, it's really for everyone. It's a great company. Just the experience. So I'll give another example, just before we get into like the caching stuff. But last 2 days, one of our customer sites it's a relatively new site, so it was, but it gets 300 visits per day or whatever, and suddenly it got 30,000 visits, like in a second. And a few minutes for Twitter. And so I was like, well, it's not hosted on BigScoots. It's hosted on WP.com. Right. And so it's hosted there because there's a reason why it's hosted there. Anyway, it worked. It scaled fine. So you say, okay, well, why doesn't just everyone use WP Cloud? I think it's support at the end of the day. I mean, apart from other things that we've discussed, but this is a very good example of, it works. And in this case, it worked, it scaled. But if you ever have an issue, like, fortunately, we didn't have an issue, but a few weeks ago, we had a small issue and we reached out, and it took hours before we heard back from them. The first response, not even like, they're checking on something. No, it took hours before we got the first response. And so as a company that supports other companies with their websites, if you're a freelancer or an agency or whatever, you cannot depend on a hosting company that will not give you pretty much immediate support, especially when something happens. And so that made it very scary for me to be like, well, hosting on something like that, well, sure, we see that it can scale, but what if you need something, like there's an emergency, you're on your own, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it depends on the scope of support that that provider is willing to do. It's kind of the whole like managed hosting term is such a loose term. It doesn't really mean anything anymore.
Yeah.
And kind of yeah, it depends, because like there is support at web hosting support out there that's fast, just like we are, but they're very siloed, where they're like the web server is online, the database is online. Oh, the plugin's slow or something like that. We're not developers. Like, oh well, that's your problem, right?
Yeah.
So, and versus like we kind of try to. I mean, we're not going to do development work for you. That's not what I'm saying. But we try to bridge that gap where we kind of have, even if the person working on our ticket isn't a developer, we have somebody that has some experience there, and we can kind of interpret things and how things are going, and just keep your website online, and figure out things on a software level as well. And this is something I see kind of changing overall in the WordPress hosting community, not just we've been doing this since BigScoots started, but it used to be like 20 years ago or 10 years ago, like web hosting was very siloed. It was very like, the sysadmin's a sysadmin and developer is a developer, and they do not cross paths whatsoever. And this is a plugin issue. Oh, you go to the developer. I'm not dealing with that. Your site's slow, not my problem, right? And then you have the developer who's like, oh, the server's slow. Not my problem. Go talk to sysadmin. So we kind of like try to meld those two together and have a team that can address both of those problems. I said we're not like saying we're going to write code for you or anything, but I'm just saying that
I'll actually give you an excellent example. Back in June, we have this customer that runs BodyBoss. For those who don't know, it's like a fork of BodyPress that gives you newsfeed capability for your users. It's very nice. But this particular site doesn't have the BodyBoss theme, which gives you all the nice styles. It just uses some of their nice features like automatic refreshes and notifications and media and stuff like that. So in order to make it look nice, unfortunately, BodyBoss does not give you just the styles for the plugin itself. You have to use their theme. So pretty much you have to grab the styles and put them on a style sheet on your site for it to look similar to how they have it. And so this was one of those scenarios. There was an update, all right? And suddenly the newsfeed, like submit button or the comment button, one of those, stopped working. So the client is freaking out because they're getting customers saying, hey, it's a nice community. So everyone's like, hey, just a heads up, it's the button's not working. No haters, fortunately. And so what you would think immediately is like, oh, the JavaScript, something broke with the update or whatever, right? Or an Ajax call, I don't know. But I reached out just as hey, did you see something change? Just as a, I don't know, precautionary measure, I sent the ticket. Samya grabbed it. He comes back to me like 2 minutes later and says, oh no, look at the CSS and this file. You're overriding pointer events on this class. And so the events are not coming through back to the button. It was a CSS thing. Like he found the code in like a 1400 line CSS code that was overriding the pointer events such that with the update, it wasn't working. And I was like, what? Like I didn't, and obviously he then said, well, we have this package where we can actually help with, and it's great. But I was blown away because I wasn't expecting it. I know it's not provided support, but the fact that he knew how to find it, like you were saying, it's not that he's going to do development work, but the fact that he knew where to look into a plugin, into an override of a plugin, and figure out the situation and give us back a response that actually helped us fix it in a matter of minutes, instead of the typical experience that most of you have seen or had, which is, oh, it's a third-party thing, we cannot help you with that, or "Hey, have you tried disabling all of your plugins and seeing if there's a..." You're like, I'm in the middle of something. So I was impressed. So I know exactly what you mean. And I think that's just marvelous.
Yeah. But I do think having that on our team and our ability to do that is kind of why, like, if you reach out to us and you're having an issue, obviously we're going to respond immediately, but we're actually going to know how to address the issue, regardless of whether it's a hardware, software, or network problem. We can figure it out. So
yeah, that's great. And for those listening, don't expect, like you said, BigScoots to develop for you or anything, but the support is tremendously fantastic. So let's talk about caching at the edge and Cloudflare. For those who don't know, Cloudflare has a content delivery network that can place all your assets around the world so that they're closer to your users. So users get them from those points that are closest to them instead of directly from your server. So you reduce the load from your server. But also it does a ton of other things, right? Very, very nice caching mechanisms that it has. How does your integration with Cloudflare differ from me getting like a free Cloudflare plan and just hooking it up to the site?
Okay, so so we have what's called our BigScoots cache plugin, and it integrates with Cloudflare's API to pretty much, like, if you update a post or if you update a page, it will tell Cloudflare to clear the cache automatically for that URL or the whole site, whatever you want it to do. And that's what's unique about our integration, is that we are controlling that. We control the TTL, pages that shouldn't be cached. Like if you don't want checkout to be cached, as example, you could define that in our plugin. So that's the biggest benefit of our caching plugin, is that, so if you were to just go sign up for a free Cloudflare account and enable like cache everything right on there, when you update your pages, your posts, Cloudflare's not going to know that was updated. So it's just going to look like it's never updated, and you're going to have to either manually go in and clear Cloudflare every time, which is cumbersome, or just not use the integration. So that's really like our strength there. And then, we have a lot of controls too. Like we have hooks where if certain plugins fire, we'll know to clear the cache. We have a lot of things going on in that plugin that it's kind of like it could be a whole other podcast in and of itself. So I'm really like scratching the surface here, but it allows you to control a lot of fine details that you wouldn't necessarily. I mean, you could do it on Cloudflare, but the amount of like JSON and stuff you'd be writing to do it all would be insane. So we're kind of just automating all of that for you. So that's our strength with our integration to Cloudflare. Also, we have Cloudflare as one of our network providers in our data center. So you're pretty much, and Cloudflare has a POP in the same building we're in. So like literally, like your data is going internally in the data center, like to Cloudflare. It's
via fiber,
shaving off milliseconds. Fiber. It's shaving off milliseconds. So that integration there alone is worth noting. And then we have, because we have it at the network level, we have like way more. I mean, not that the standard free Cloudflare or even paid ones can't handle a DDoS attack, but like because we're at the network level with them, we can handle stuff even if you're not even using Cloudflare. Like even if you don't have a Cloudflare account, you're using like GoDaddy DNS or something, you still have that like DDoS protection there. There's a lot of things. I know we're going on caching, but I'm just saying, like, our integration with Cloudflare is like, I don't think any other provider has the same level of integration that we have with them. So
I agree. I don't think so. Let's, again, we're not just talking about BigScoots, but in this scenario, this is very important for people to understand. Cloudflare is fantastic. I've used it for many years. You can open a free account and set it up as your CDN. There even is a little option where it's like having a static site. You can enable it for WordPress, and it's like $5 a month or whatever, and it just caches everything, and it's tremendously fast. So if you have a static site or a site that doesn't move a lot, or it's not very dynamic, you can use that, and it's great, tremendously fast. But it doesn't work for dynamic sites very well. And so doing everything that Zach was just talking about, where it will do like the extreme caching that it does, but will clear it upon a little adjustment on a page, or for everything, or based on hooks or stuff like that. That is where the sweet stuff is. That is where, if you had your own tech team in your company managing this huge website, that's what they would be doing for you, right? And so it's amazing when you have it, if you've seen it in action, but it's very hard to do on your own if you're a small business or just an agency. So having it work through that plugin it's crazy. I wasn't aware of it before, and I wasn't aware of the performance benefits before I used it, but we were getting like non-cached page. Yeah, everyone can know whatever the speed of a non-cached page is. Even if you had a slow site, there was this particular very slow Elementor site that was like, I don't know, it might take 2 seconds to load, right? Or 3 seconds for certain pages. When the plugin went through its magic, the page load times were like 20 milliseconds or less. And it was like, what? How is this working? And it would not have stale cache. Like, it would just always be what you needed to see on the page. So
yeah, that's the beauty of edge caching, is that, like, and if people don't really know, so it's Cloudflare as an example, and there's other CDNs out there, Bunny and CloudFront and stuff, and they all kind of offer a similar approach to this. But Cloudflare essentially has all of these locations across the world. And let's say you're in Europe, right? You're in London or France or something like that, and you want to request a website that's like, let's say, a BigScoots customer. Well, in an old school, before all this existed, you would have to your connection would have to go all the way to Chicago, then all the way back however many times, right? And that's where you would see those like 100, 200, 300 ms load times to go across the world. Well, what Cloudflare is doing is they're caching your page at the edge. So instead of, if you're in Paris and Cloudflare has a location in Paris, you're getting the HTML from the website and other assets from the server Cloudflare has in Paris. So that automation there. And what we're doing with BigScoots is we are telling that Paris location, if there's an update to the page or whatever, to clear out just that URL or that element or that asset just for that page, that like that visitor in France isn't seeing a different version of your site than somebody that's in America. So we're just kind of automating all of that with our plugin and other integrations we have with Cloudflare. So we're like fully on board with Cloudflare. We use them a lot. But I mean, you can do the same thing with other, if you're not on us, there's other CDNs, all hosts us have similar things. And some of them even have their own plugins and stuff like that. But you know, I just know like how our setup is. It's very dialed in. So
yeah, and it saves you a lot of time as a consumer to have that. And of course, if you're somewhere else, you could do this on your own. It's good that you know that it exists. So if you really want to make your site extremely fast, leveraging these things that Cloudflare and other companies like you were saying, like Bunny or Cloudflare offer you, is a great thing to do. On top of what we've discussed before, right? You first want to make sure that your site is as nimble as possible. You don't want your site loading in 3 seconds just because, even if there's no traffic, right? If that happens, then there's probably a lot of things going on that are taking a lot of resources. How fast would you say a typical WordPress, like a very basic install of WordPress with nothing on it, would load on, like without
no caching or anything? Like a couple hundred ms,
right?
Probably.
Yeah. So a lot of people don't expect this. They would think, oh, WordPress is slow or whatever, because by the time they see WordPress set up for them, it's typically already has a bunch of plugins doing a bunch of stuff, right? And this is one of the things I really like about the block editor and full site editing and all this, that a lot of the blocks now don't load all of the CSS and JavaScript on every page. They just load it on whenever it's actually the blocks on the page. And so this will slowly allow plugin companies to build in this way, such that just having a form plugin on your site doesn't mean that every page on the site is going to load all the JavaScript for that, right? And so that is going to help. Which brings me to my next question. So people often think plugins are bad. Like, not bad, but, oh, you have many plugins, that's why your site is slow. While it could be true, it actually really depends on what the plugin is doing and how it's built, right? So how can a plugin affect the page load time?
The page load time. So it really it depends on the plugin. You mean you kind of already said it, but like, so say you have a form plugin and it decides to load the form JS on every page of your site, but you only have the form on one page, right? Um, that's slowing down. That's the amount of JavaScript that's loading in the visitor's browser is going to be increase your total blocking time. It could affect your IMP core web vital. There's a lot of things there that could affect. So but if you had a plugin that was smart, like you said, that, or using the block editor, but just in general, like if you have a form plugin that knows, okay, the form shortcode's only on this page, we're only going to load the CSS and the JS for the form on this page. That's a better plugin to use because it's going to speed things up, reduce the amount of assets that are being loaded, right? So you're just trying to reduce the amount of things that are being loaded. And then, like I said, the plugin ecosystem is very big, so it's kind of hard to like. I'm trying to give an example. Like I said, that broken link checker plugin, right, is an example, right? That's looking for like internal content, making sure internal linking is working, and like if you reference this URL in another article, it's looking for that, and that's a great plugin to have if you have like 80,000 posts and you're trying to make sure all your content's like always kind of working well, and your SEO is good in that regard for internal linking and stuff. But if you have like 8 posts on your website, you probably don't need that plugin, right? Like it's this overkill, right? So and also for page load, I'm trying to think of what else. I mean, obviously you want a caching plugin, right? Like we were talking about, like you want to cache things. Things that would I'm thinking of examples that would negatively affect page load. I mean, this is kind of a touchy subject, but like a lot of these page builders you see out there, like you see Elementor, Divi, Avada, Theme Fusion, Beaver Builder, all these things, they are notorious for loading, and there's some of them are getting better. I'm not trying to dog them all, but they're notorious for loading everything everywhere all the time. You know, and that can really affect your overall page speed, your performance, page load, everything, and trying to avoid. I mean, there's a strength to them, right? Because they're easy to use. If you have a customer that just wants a drag and drop builder for their website, it's kind of hard to beat it. I totally get that. But you know, if you're building out a site that needs to perform very well, those can really negatively affect your overall performance and page load. So avoiding those, and then because if you use something like, say, base example like Genesis, right, or Cadence, right, those themes. I'm not saying every child theme of those is perfect either, but generally speaking, something built on like Genesis or Cadence, it's only going to load what it needs on that page. That's just the way it's built. And versus, you know, again, Elementor, Divi, all these other things out there, they're kind of notorious for it, and they are getting a little bit better. Like they've Elementor's introduced some of its page speed of their experiments and stuff like that. So there's things there to fix it. Divi has some options to improve things as well, so they're getting better. And then getting a little bit off page load, just talking about plugins real quick, like security is a big thing, right? Like if you're not using a plugin, don't keep it, because all it takes is that plugin author getting like hit by a bus tomorrow. Not saying that should happen, but like God forbid, but and then all of a sudden that plugin's not maintained, and then you've had it installed on your site for 3 years and it's never been updated, and then all of a sudden there's you know, something compromised in it and the plugin author can't patch it, and now your website just like wide open to the world for this exploit to happen. And even on maintained plugins, there is security exploits that happen all the time. If you check like the popular WordPress blogs, I mean, there's every day there's an article about 30,000 sites were compromised, blah 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 blah. Plugin that is definitely, so the less footprint you can have. Like just install what you need. Don't just have this there. And if it's deactivated, just still remove it. Like that's kind of like one of those things.
That's important. So everyone note this. You don't only have to deactivate it, because if you deactivate it, those functions might not work. They might not be initialized, but the code is still there in those directories, right?
Yep.
Better to delete them if you are not using them. Fortunately, even Core is starting to let you know of some of these things. You have some things that you don't need here. Get rid of this, blah blah blah, which is nice. Speaking of security, and I don't mean to ask something. If it's another department, that's fine.
delve in. I'm not like the expert, but we do sell like our performance and security
Yes,
package that I help people for it.
that's
Yep.
what I want to ask about. So we've used WordFence for a very long time for many customers. Now we just use your performance and security package, which is great. So what for those who don't know, WordFence, and maybe many of you do, is a plugin that will scan your site for vulnerabilities. It might scan the plugins and compare it to lists with current exploits and things like that. And it might even, if you have their service, it might even patch the site itself before the exploit gets fixed in the actual plugin sometimes, right? And so it's a good tool to have, but it is very slow sometimes. So it affects, especially if you have a lot of requests coming into your site, it might really slow down and affect your performance. And so there are alternatives to that, right? Like BigScoots has their performance security package. How can a host provide that level of security where the person doesn't need a WordFence or Sucuri or anything like that, and instead have it be managed by the host? How does that work?
So there's a lot of different variables to this, but I'll start on the server level and then I'll kind of go there. So on the server level, like the host can have like a security config of like saying these directories can run these files in them, right? So like your uploads directory, like your image directory, shouldn't have like PHP files in them that are running, right? So that's just like a really basic thing you can do. And I think even like a bare bones cPanel install on like DigitalOcean or something probably has a lot of those rules in there, right? So it's pretty basic stuff. And don't quote me on that, but I'm just saying like most site, it's pretty common to have that. And like we expand on that, like at BigScoots, where we have kind of our own security rules that we've added onto there, and we even like whitelist plugins, right? Because like we don't want some randomly named plugin to like be able to run PHP on your site. So we kind of have certain files that we allow. We have like this master list of plugins we allow on our service that's maintained by somebody else. It's not me, but so that's kind of there on the basics, and they could go into that way more depth than I can. And then on the application level, like you said, like you can use something like WordFence. We prefer PatchStack for our customers because PatchStack actually virtually patches the code. So rather than trying to catch it with a WAF, right, it's preventing that malicious code from running. So like instead of looking at a query, right, like a WAF is looking at a URL or a query and trying to block that, this is actually like just not letting it run at all. Like you could hit it as many times for the exploit and it's not gonna happen. And then getting off that application level, you have like Cloudflare or Sucuri or these other services that a lot of hosts provide as well, which is a WAF or web application firewall. And WordPress has a WAF, and PatchStack has a WAF too. But essentially, the web application firewall is just looking for certain queries or a multitude of things and blocking those from happening, known exploits. And they kind of have like they set up it's been a while. Not honey buckets. They set up a trap. I forgot
honeypots.
Honeypot, and they set up a trap on various sites, and they see what are these scammers or these exploiters doing to websites across the internet, and then they see the rules and they kind of implement that in their WAF, and that's like what Cloudflare and Sucuri and these big security companies are doing. So yeah, as a host, there's kind of a multitude level, right? Like they got to offer on the server level, right, preventing certain files from running in directories they shouldn't. Make sure file permissions and ownership is good, right? All the kind of really basic like sysadmin type of level stuff. And then you have your kind of your plugins, whatever you want to run on that level, and then your WAF. And the cool thing about Cloudflare, right, is you get the web application firewall now on their free plan. So you could essentially deploy that on any site for free. It's not like a you don't have to have a plugin. It's not going to slow anything down. So that's something that's kind of nice that you can do. It's not going to catch everything, but it'll catch a majority of things. Personally have seen multiple sites where like they were not using Cloudflare, and this plugin gets this list gets released on some WordPress blog that says 5 million sites are exposed to this, and I'll see all these sites that are running like bare bones GoDaddy and DNS or something and not using Cloudflare's WAF, and they all get compromised. And I'll see everything on Cloudflare not even get touched, even though they didn't have WordFence, didn't have anything. It just Cloudflare caught it. Like they approaches. So there's a lot of strength there. I'm not trying to turn this podcast into a Cloudflare sales event either, but it's
No,
definitely
they're good. They
good
do
piece of
well.
software.
What they do well. And I have seen it where you even some customers have seen, like, I don't know, they have this plugin that is trying to do a legit query, but it's a weird query, and it'll get flagged by Cloudflare. So it's impressive because it's actually they're admins, they're on the side, they're doing something in the plugin, and it might be modifying a query, a database query or something, and it won't work. And then you go into your Cloudflare panel with free Cloudflare, mind you. You go into the panel and you see that event, and where it's blocking it, it's telling you why and why it thought that was supposed to be blocked. And so and you can whitelist that user or whatever, which is a good idea. Instead of allowing it for everyone, you can just say, okay, so for this IP it's fine, or whatever. But yeah, you bring up a good point. If you can offload some of this to the hosting provider or the edge, then you don't have to see all those. So you don't have to have that internal audit with WordPress or something like that that's constantly checking every visit. Because that's also some more processing that's happening on every visit. Whereas if it's just offloaded somewhere else, you don't even see those, right? So
and like I said, I'm a big believer in PatchStack. I've used in their product for a long time, and then also like I was in the WordCamp in Portland and stuff, and hung out with them and stuff. They're great guys, like they really know what they're doing. And PatchStack, like they, I just like the fact that they're patching the vulnerability like at where it lies, rather than relying on some scanner or a WAF or something to catch it. They're solving the problem. I mean, so that to me is worth looking into if you're looking for some more software. And like I said, we include PatchStack with our performance and security plans. But I'm not trying to make this too much of a sales podcast, but
it works. That's what I use now. Whenever I have someone on BigScoots, I don't use WordPress anymore. I just use that because I feel it's faster, but also I don't know. I feel a bit safer knowing that someone is monitoring, and PatchStack, they do very good stuff. So I think it's fine, and I do like WordFence. Like if I was hosting anywhere else, I might do WordFence, just like that's the first thing I install because I don't feel secure, right? But if you, I think it's nice to feel secure out of the box. Like I could just have a vanilla WordPress install and not need to install security on it immediately because I trust the infrastructure. I think that's nice, but obviously you have some security. But
and on our even on our like our, you talk about performance security plan, on our Cloudflare enterprise setup, we have like an advanced WAF that's even more. The rules are way stricter than the free WAF that you get with Cloudflare. So it's kind of like something that we've kind of tweaked and made our own rule set and adjusted things. And I think Cloudflare has a more, they add things from their honeypots and stuff more proactively in their enterprise setup as well. So it's another layer of protection that we offer. And again, that other hosts, there's other hosts that have Cloudflare enterprise integration as well, like WP Engine and stuff like that. So, but
nice.
There's a lot of cool stuff out there, cool technology. So
why do some plugins, you were talking about like the JavaScript, which is okay, that's client side, and some of those JavaScript events are even going to send Ajax queries back to the server, and that'll affect maybe not the visit, but the rest of the server's experience. But there's also the actual PHP code that runs within the plugins. So why do some plugins slow down the site just by like not even looking at the page, but just server render time? It slows it off. You turn off the plugin, every page loads faster. Turn it off, turn it on again, it goes slower. And it's because it's processing all of this PHP code everywhere, like we were saying. But some of them don't. Like there's some big, massive plugins that don't affect performance at all. But then there's others like Woo that just brings down like a second and a half. So what is there a way for a plugin to not load all its code or not run its code if it shouldn't, or like who's or is there a way to, if you already have a plugin that you know is slow, to have it not load on every page because you know that it's just gonna load on like checkout, or is that just wishful thinking?
This is like a I mean, it really depends on the situation too. Like, this is kind of like going into like more hardcore like engineering, like software engineering stuff, but like that I'm not too versed on. But yeah, I mean, it really depends. Like, I know real world examples that I've seen, so I'll talk about that, right? Like, there is a plugin out there, and I totally forget the name, but it's because I'm, I don't do a lot of podcasts, but there's a plugin out there that like if you visit the site, it dynamically generates the images and optimizes them, right? And this fires like an AJAX call and does all these things on the back end, and the page can't be cached, right? And this is like notorious plugin that causes issues. It'll present all the image file names with like a query string on the end, so Cloudflare bypasses them. It's just like a great way to overload your server, right? So just like we could identify that and figure out, okay, this plugin's causing that. It's probably not the best example. I'm just trying to kind of give an idea of like of how some plugins are more performant than others. It just depends on what they're trying to do. If they're trying to process a lot of things, or they're trying to, a WooCommerce checkout, there's a lot of things going on, right? In the checkout. I mean, they got to write that data to the database. They have to talk to Stripe or whatever your payment processor is. They have to, update the product quantity. They have to do a lot of things when a checkout is occurring, right? So that sometimes you can't avoid it.
But what I find strange is there are plugins that do more than WooCommerce.
Yep.
But that don't affect all pages. So WooCommerce, being as great as it is, and it's getting better, especially with the blogs, you just enable it or disable it, and the whole site slows down considerably, maybe 500 milliseconds or more. And that just happens across the board. And I wonder, like, why? I mean, obviously they need to make it better, but it's one of those things where there has to be a solution. Do you know Perf Matters, the tool?
Yes, I'm very familiar with Perf.
It has a very nice, for those who don't know, it's very good performance enhancing tool. You have to tweak it quite a bit, but it's very helpful, especially for what Zach was talking about earlier about JavaScript. Like, you can get rid of the JavaScript on any page based on, like, I don't want this plugin to load, etc., etc. The JavaScript and the CSS, or you can just make it not load the assets at all, which is great. But I've always wondered, like, wouldn't it be nice if there was something like that, but that would actually disable the code, the plugin's code, completely from running? And you know how the health and troubleshooting plugin works? Yeah. The core one?
A little bit. I mean,
it's a nice plugin, because if you're having issues, you as the admin, you click on a plugin, it'll disable everything and just keep that. Or you can enable 5 of them or 10 of them, but it loads the pages, and it'll just load that code. So I wonder, why can't we do something like that where I could say, in all of these other pages, I don't care about not loading this plugin at all. Like, forget it exists, and only load it at checkout or at a certain.
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of do that, like I said, with a third-party plugin like Perf Matters, right? So,
but they don't disable the whole plugin's code. They take out JavaScript and some other assets, but the code itself still runs. Not like the health and troubleshooting plugin. That one actually kills it completely. So I don't know if it's just, I don't know if it's possible. If anyone knows,
maybe you have a new product idea or something. I don't know.
that would be swell. Yeah, because it's a lot of times, like, you actually really need that plugin, and they're not going to change it anytime soon because they're a beast. But you don't need the functionality everywhere else, and so you could just turn it off.
You're talking about, like, I mean, do you run a lot of like Buddy Boss sites and stuff like that?
Yeah, some. Like Buddy Boss would be a good example.
Notorious one for that,
Yeah, and then WooCommerce learned that the events calendar.
Yes.
Man, the events calendar, you turn it on and just brings it down. And I like it. I like what the company does, but it's just really, really slow. And not the event pages. It's just everywhere. Every page. Actually, the event page loads fast. But everything else that has nothing to do with it it just slows it down. So it would be nice if I could say no events calendar anywhere on the site except the event page, the create event page, or wherever. I don't mind because we're expecting that. But I don't know. I've never heard of anything that does that. So if anyone knows about that, that would be swell.
Yeah. There's a lot of things that you wish you could do sometimes with WordPress, but you can do a lot. I mean, it's way more powerful even than it was like 5 years ago. So it's kind of crazy how things have evolved. But you mentioned Perf Matters. That's kind of like, as one of the performance engineers, that's a tool that I find myself in like 6 hours out of my 8-hour day. So I'm very familiar with Perf Matters, just because I optimize a lot of sites using it. So yeah, I mean, if you want to get into application, level performance and improving page speed and core web vitals, that's kind of like my bread and butter too. So, but yeah.
So how does, because I know for some sites you enable Perf Matters and you just go in and tweak and remove anything that you don't need, which is still a very big help. But I've seen scenarios where it's hard, right? So even for someone like your team, it's like, oh no, but this site is too dynamic. It has too many plugins or whatever. So it's very hard to actually set everything up in a way where it's going to be stable, right? So what's the suggestion there? Should we just try to use less plugins, or in general? Well, in general, yes, but
that's a hard one. There's different approaches to things. So yeah, I mean, it really try to make your site as lightweight as possible. I mean, it's always the best approach. But if you have a heavy dynamic site, obviously there's SEO impacts to this, but sometimes we can recommend putting something on a subdomain, right? So and just separating out entirely, right? Because that or in a directory, a subdirectory, right? So like, say you have a form, like, or Buddy Boss or something. You say you have a message board. It'd be better to be like form.domain.com, and then you can literally put that form on a completely separate server from your static site. And that way, your static site with your blog articles and stuff that's like producing your inbound traffic is, fast as any other static WordPress blog would be. And then your discussion forum or Buddy Boss or LearnDash or whatever is separated out. And then that way, it's more or less like just running the plugins you need for that. So you're kind of just separating things out. And that's something we kind of recommend sometimes. But obviously there is the SEO impacts there. If you have a private membership, it's not really going to matter, right? Because it's not like Google's indexing these pages. But if you have like a message board and you have all of this inbound traffic for these message or questions or whatever you have on there, that's not really our thing to advise you on, but it's just something that it could be an impact, and why some people want to keep it all on one site. And there's also like, if they have to separate things out, I mean, you're looking at like sometimes some major database administration work that has to happen to kind of, there's a lot of things that could happen there. So it just depends on what you're trying to do. But every situation is different. So
but I do see that actually being a good idea for some scenarios, like you're saying, private communities. Would that work? Let's say multi-site. If you run a multi-site and you have like the main site, and then maybe a sub-site has the Buddy Boss or the community or whatever, would the page loads on one of the sites be affected by that? Not obviously, but the traffic, yes. But I mean, the page load on one page of one site on the multi-site does not load anything from another site in the multi-site that is not part of that site, right? So if they have separate plugins that are active.
Yeah. I'm not a fan of multi-site personally, but like for performance purposes. But I still think it would be better just to have
separate sites,
separate WordPress installs entirely on different servers. I mean, or that would be the most performant approach I would advise on.
And is there an efficient way to keep users in sync such that people could just go back and forth without having to set up like
SSL? So I've seen a lot of our customers with certain like membership sites and stuff do have a little widget that they can put like in the top right of the site where you
Hmm.
can see if you're logged in and stuff like that to the membership portal.
Hmm.
But it's for the subdirectory site, so or subdomain site. So um, it's situational dependent, but I have seen that
Hmm.
work. And it's either whether it's a custom implementation or it's something that one of those plugins offer. I'm not entirely sure, but yeah,
Right.
I have seen that happen. And this is kind of best case. I get it that some people have sites that they can't separate out and they just want it to be
Yeah.
all in one. And we
Hmm.
we you know we will make it work. We'll put you on a fast server and we'll optimize things as best we can and tell you what plugins are causing problems and things like that. So um, to get, like I said earlier in this chat, it's all situational. We'll just kind of
Hmm.
we'll figure it out together. So
That's right. I think that's what people should take from this. It's when you're looking for a hosting company, you should, well, first make sure your site is optimized on its own. If you can host it
mhm,
locally and see that everything works and it's fast, then okay, now it's time to choose a hosting company. And when you're choosing a hosting company, make sure that you are getting what you're paying for in the sense that you understand what they're offering or try to understand. Maybe try to talk with their sales team or even the support, and see what level of support you're getting. I think that's the most important thing after it working, right? But if it works, support is the most important thing in my opinion, because if you don't have support from your hosting company, then if something happens, you're going to be in trouble. And minutes off of a day, especially a busy day like the one that's coming up,
mhm,
you get downtime on Black Friday, and that's a ton of money that's left on the table. And so you definitely want a company that will give you the support that you deserve. At that point, BigScoots fantastic for support. There are other companies as well that have good support, but what Zach has been talking about, if you can find a company like what BigScoots does, obviously BigScoots, it's a great company, but if you find, just look for someone who actually considers you in their decisions for your site,
yep,
right? Like you were saying, there might be some adjustments that they can make to make your site more performant based on what you need. There might be a different configuration of a server for what you need. You might not need a dedicated server, or you might need a dedicated server based on
mhm,
your um, particular scenario. And what I've seen with BigScoots is you can talk to their team and let them know what the footprint looks like of your site, and they will tell you, huh, you don't need a dedicated server, you need this, or you do need, or you need two redundant servers or whatever. And
mhm,
I think that's very important to consider, especially if you're growing your business through your site, because a lot of companies will say it might be $1 million, like multi-million-dollar company, and they still want to pay $50 a month for hosting. You're like, doesn't make sense. Like if you are selling, make sure you're on something that will hold up if something happens, because if not, it's going to cost you a lot more,
yep.
right? So I think this is all very interesting, and we, like you said, we could have gone into a lot of more technical stuff that we can definitely go on another podcast. But I I think it's a good portion of it to leave people with the understanding of some of the things that one needs to consider. We talked about plugins and how the queries work, and why does it matter if your host has PHP workers or not, or memory, or why sometimes you might need a higher clock speed for your server, and why sometimes you may not. So I hope this has been helpful for people, and I want to thank you, Zach, for coming
Yep.
on and sharing your knowledge. Where can people find you if they want to reach out, or Big Scoots in general? Are you on Twitter or X or any other
Yeah,
networks?
Twitter has. I'm bad. I'm not really on social media, but BigScoots itself, they have on all the platforms. I mean, we have a live chat on our website. You could just like hop in and talk to us. We don't have chat bots. We're always human. So, anytime you can
Yes.
come in thing. And if you're a customer, you can submit a ticket. Like if you want us to audit your site or look at things anytime, just let us know. So,
Excellent. And I can vouch for that too. Katie and her team. It's like live chat, always real people, always happy to help. And sometimes they even recognize you, which is always an interesting thing
Yep.
to see from a hosting company. And supporting tickets. For those who haven't worked with BigScoots, if you ever do work with BigScoots, you might find it different that you have to submit a ticket. But I've had the experience that submitting a ticket on BigScoots gets you a response faster from a person who knows their stuff than a live chat will on other
Yeah.
So
And the big thing
it's
is
amazing.
The big thing is like we can see your all your history and our ticketing system of problems you've had, and it gives us like a quick, like we can see like your entire customer experience and setup and everything when you submit a ticket. Not that live chat support software can't do that in certain places, but for us it just like you submit a ticket, we're like on top of it, we know exactly what's happening, we're verified. Like, and for us personally, the kind of the old school ticket desk or help desk works for us for the way we run our business. So
Well, Zach, I really appreciate you coming on. When I got the recommendation for BigScoots, I did not know who BigScoots was. I hadn't heard about the company. Now you hear about them more, but then I found that a lot of very high traffic and very performance heavy websites use BigScoots. So you're very big in the space, but it's not like everyone knows GoDaddy, right? Or WP Engine or Kiss or whatever. And I just feel it's a fantastic brand, excellent support. And this is not a paid podcast by any means, but I really have had the most wonderful experience with them. And so really recommend BigScoots to anyone who's listening. All right. So thanks a lot, Zach.